Welcome to the Cyber Center for Biblical Studies. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we're going to examine a book entitled You Are What You Love, written by James Smith. And to introduce us to this book, we have with us Senior Pastor Tim Sprankle from Leesburg Grace Brethren Church here in northern Indiana. Tim, welcome.
Hi, Herb. Thanks.
Tell us a little something about this book. What might you say is the driving force, the thesis of this book?
Well, the title is pretty self-explanatory. You are what you love. What Smith is trying to do in this book is explain that a lot of what we do in discipleship and church thinking and spiritual formation is we try to train people a certain way to think. And if we can get them to think a certain way, then they'll behave a certain way. And he's suggesting that we are creatures of love and of habit that grows out of our love, not just creatures that are thinking creatures. So essentially, he's looking at this idea that we're more than thinking things, we're loving things, and at the core, God has created us to love. So we need to analyze our loves, and when we start to analyze our loves, we can actually retrain them so we're loving God as our top priority. And then the secondary gifts that he gives us, we're loving those secondarily.
Okay, so it's mental and emotional.
Yeah,
Okay.
and he says that so much of the weight that we give is to the mental side of things, that if we can just give people truth, then they'll change their behavior. And he says that we're being formed constantly by liturgies. This is something that comes up in his book a lot. Cultural liturgies in our churches, that we need to pay attention to those liturgies because they're shaping unconscious thoughts or unconscious habits, and we can pay closer attention to those things.
How does he unfold this book? Does he divide the book into sections? Are they chapters? What is it? How does he develop this thesis?
He has 7 chapters in the book, and the first chapter is laying out the situation that you are more than a thinking thing, that you're actually also a creature that's searching for a telos. You might know this term. You would know this term from Greek, more from philosophy. What's the end? What's your desired goal? And so he lays out the first chapter is that we're all searching out a desired goal. And the second chapter then gets at this idea of cultural liturgies. What are the places that you walk into that are forming you, and how do they form you in a way that it changes your goal? It might change your goal. So the second chapter has this great, it's well known, and for people who've read his book, they'll often talk about cultural liturgy of the shopping mall and how we become consumerists. And the shopping mall is this cathedral that we go to, and it's this religious practice, and it's forming something in us that says, I shop, therefore I am. I mean, I could tell you a little bit more about the chapter in that particular one, but he says our churches have a culture too, and our homes have a culture. So part of what the rest of this book then does is helps us pay attention to the liturgies of our churches, but then there's a chapter on the liturgies of our homes, the liturgies that we create for our children, and then even the work that you have, the work that you do, your vocation. He does have more of a Reformed background, so he'll use words like vocation to talk about and liturgy to talk about what God does to shape you. But that's the final chapter, is how there are liturgies in your work.
What spurred you to read this? What was it that caused you to even pick this book up and want to read it?
Yeah. Well, the other book that he has, he's written a series of books that talk about cultural liturgies and worship. And as a local church pastor, I'm very interested in worship. And from different perspectives too, because when I tend to think worship, I think Chris Tomlin music, or I think like, what's the next Hillsong album that's going to come out? And worship is far more than music. It's the whole of life. I also think of things that happen in church that can be part of worship. You have a sermon, you might have bread in the cup or some sort of communion baptism. Again, worship's bigger than that. And so I wanted to think about what is worship, and how can I help myself become a better worshiper? How can I help other people who serve in my church become better worshipers? What's taking place in the act of worship? So this is the smallest of his books. The other ones are thicker, and they go together as part of a series. I also read from Google reviews or Amazon reviews, this is the most user-friendly out of all of them. He kind of condenses his core thoughts and puts it into this particular title. And I'd also recently read a book called The Power of Habit. And this one says the spiritual power of habit as far as the subtitle goes. And so I'd been thinking along the lines of, what are the habits that I have in my spiritual life that help me become a better worshiper, and how can I push Christians in that direction? So when my friend Andrew had a copy of it and said, "You want to read this?" I said, "Absolutely." And I took his copy and ate it up real fast.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the most insightful thing that you got out of the book?
I really liked that idea of analyzing what you love. And in the second chapter, he says, what you think you love may not be what you really love. And he really challenges you to take an analysis of your life. Like, look at what you spend your time, what you pour your emotional energy into. And honestly, these are probably the things that you love and care about more than you think you do. And just this very basic question, this has been really helpful pastorally for me, is what do you want? What's your telos? What do you want? I remember going for a jog just 3 months ago with a couple guys from my church, and I had been reading through this book, and I asked these guys, what do you want? And you ask people, how's your day? How's your week? What are you thinking? What are you reading? What's been going on? But what do you want? Like at the root, what do you want? It's a big question. And I think that was the takeaway for me, is getting at what do I really love, and how does that line up with the two greatest commandments that God's given us, to love God and to love others.
You mentioned this was the smallest of his books,
Yeah.
which means he's left things out. When you think about the book as a whole, is there something you wish he had put in this book? It's condensed, it's short, it's to the point. If he could add a chapter, what might that chapter be?
That's a good question. I think one thing that I would have wanted a little bit more of is show me a few more cultural liturgies. He wove some of these throughout. He spent a lot of time developing the liturgy of the mall. But honestly, most people do their shopping online anymore. So that's a different cultural liturgy. And I would like him to update some of those things.
Okay.
He talked about the liturgy of the table and eating in general, and how when you live in a fast food culture, it forms you in a certain way. I love those cultural elements, but I wish there would have been a few more that were unpackaged for me. So it gets me spinning, thinking, okay, how do I see some of these liturgies? I wouldn't have minded if he gave me a few more examples of that. And then the other thing that I felt like was maybe glaring from my church context, because I don't come from quite as much of a liturgical church background, I want to see how does this fit into a non-reformed church. So if you're part of a Baptist church or a non-denominational church and you're doing more of the contemporary worship and you don't necessarily have bread in the cup, I know there's a liturgy there, but help me think through how I'm forming my people with that. So maybe a chapter on that specific issue is, how does a contemporary worship service still provide a helpful liturgy to people?
Just even listening to you, one of the things that came to my mind, which won't resonate with you so much, but the liturgy of Facebook and social media.
Yep.
How does that formulate and part of your life? Because it is a big part of a lot of people's lives.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, and one other thing, since you asked the question, what could he have added? The irony in a book like this is I'm reading this and I'm thinking, man, this is really insightful. This is maybe a missing question in my life. What do I want? What do I love? But I'm reading a 250-page book to change my thinking on the kind of question I ask. So it always feels a little bit like, okay, I still need to re-inform myself on how I'm being formed. You cannot completely separate the intellectual from the emotional.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
And even spiritual.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all part and parcel. As a chaplain, one of the things I always appreciated about the hospital I worked with was they dealt with the physical, but they also dealt with the emotional and the spiritual. They're all interrelated.
Right.
You know, and so sometimes we compartmentize ourselves, and that's just not the way we're made.
Right.
And so anyway, well, cool. Well, let me. Are there any other books? I mean, you did mention the fact that he has a series.
Yeah.
Are there other books that you might recommend that might be a nice companion to this one?
Yeah, I'd say two other ones. One is from a secular perspective, and it's a book called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. It's a really, really interesting book on how habits are formed and how you can retrain yourself to form new habits. And I think there's a lot of things that you can learn in that book that would translate to the spiritual life. And so I would say that's a really good book that deals with habit. And one of the reasons I picked this up was because it's spiritual habit, and I wanted that spiritual element. The other one is After You Believe by N.T. Wright. He talks a lot in there about virtue and how virtue is something that you develop over time by creating good spiritual habits. There's the training of the mind, but there's the discipline of the body that takes place. And N.T. Wright's really good at attacking this idea that once you get saved, you can just wait till you go off to heaven. No, after you believe, there's something for you. And what God's called us to is a life of spiritual fruit that we see in virtue. And so I think his book is a good companion. In fact, Smith quotes N.T. Wright a couple times in his book because N.T. Wright's saying something similar in After You Believe.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for sharing this. And it really is something to keep mindful because we deal with, as pastors, the mind.
Yeah.
And always, every sermon, it's the mind a lot of times. Teaching what God's Word says, but there's more to it than just the mind. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us. And I trust this might be a book you consider looking into, particularly for those of us who preach on a regular basis and teach on a regular basis, to realize that there's more to the spiritual walk than just formulating and training the mind. There's the emotion and spiritual aspect as well. In the meantime, I trust that you will walk with the King and that you will be a blessing to everyone that you come in contact with today. Thank you.